Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. So, yeah, it's a huge pleasure today to welcome Professor Ed Barbier to give our nature seminar. I did an ecological economics master's program, I don't know, 6 years ago or something, and Ed's work was really central to that program. So there's a long legacy that has been affected by Ed's work. It's kind of crazy if you scroll through Ed's academic history, because he's contributed to such an incredibly vast number of research agendas that have become normal today, but you kind of forget that there were people at the start of all of those things. Pioneering work in ecosystem services and natural capital valuation, pioneering work in contemporary environmental economics more generally. So it's just an amazing pleasure to welcome Professor Ed Barbier from Colorado State University to give today's talk on the economics of nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very nice. Thank you so much, and I appreciate everyone coming here in person, considering what a beautiful day it is out there, and it's the day after May Day. So what the hell are you doing here for? Yeah. Joe Burgess and I, Joe's my wife and co-author on so many things, and including this work here I'm going to talk about. We have been here since January, and I have to thank the Oxford Martin School for that. It's been a great pleasure. This is our last couple hours after 4 months, so it's kind of ironic that I'm giving a talk at the end, which I think is great, and I appreciate everyone coming here. So the title of what I want to talk about is Economics of Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Mitigation. And that's actually the title of a forthcoming article that Joe and I have written. I was hoping it'd be at least online so I could give you a reference to it, but it's coming out, and some of you may have seen the final version. And although that's most of the talk is going to be about that, about what we wrote in the article, I want to go beyond that to talk about some of the things that Sophus was mentioning, which is why do we care about nature? Why do we want to invest in nature in general? And why are we not investing in nature is probably the more accurate question. So I want to go from something that's a little more specific, which is nature-based solutions, and then get into the whole thing, which I think many of you are interested in, which is why aren't we doing more to save, restore, manage nature better? So we're going to start by focusing on nature-based solutions and their role in carbon markets. I want to also talk about what Joe and I found when we looked into how nature-based projects are evaluated. We want to look at the various things that we think need some improvement on carbon benefits, the co-benefits, which I'll explain in a minute, and then, of course, some of the costs, including distributional impacts. And then I want to talk about 3 things that are particularly relevant to nature-based solutions, which are real challenges, and that's additionality, leakage, and permanence, and why these are important issues about nature-based solutions. And then something that others have not talked about, which Joe and I decided to explore, is what's the long-run potential here? And when we started this article, nature-based solutions were pretty much at their peak around 2021, 2022. And then suddenly in carbon markets, they've dropped off. And that got us thinking about, well, what's the long-run mitigation potential? And we started to thinking about nature-based solutions compared to other forms of mitigating carbon, in particular, what we call energy and technology-based solutions. And then I want to get to the bigger question. So this first part, all the way through long run, that's from our paper. There's a lot more details on that in our paper, a lot more case studies and examples to illustrate. I want to go over the basis, but I want to use that as a launching pad to talk about why do we fail to invest in nature? What's wrong with us? And I'm an economist, and I can tell you the problem is not with the ecologists and the indigenous people and sociologists. Problems with the economy, how our economy works. And I can say that as an economist because I've been studying this problem. And the problem has to do with a major flaw in our economies, which is how we view or how we don't take into account ecological scarcity and why that leads to underpricing of nature. And then I'm going to bring it back to a specific example that shows that despite all this problem, there are ways forward to try and save parts of nature, that we can come up with strategies. And another piece of work that Joe and I did, which was on the economics of peatlands for the Global Peatland Initiative. We did this about 4 years ago in 2021. I'm going to use that as a policy example to show that we can come up with a strategy if we'd like to end the underpricing and underinvestment in peatlands. So hopefully this will be of interest to everyone. But if you'd rather be outside in the sunshine, I'm not offended if you want to leave. And then I'll end up with some final remarks. Okay, so nature-based solutions. I think probably everyone in this room and online know pretty much what I'm talking about here, but just to be safe, they're generally actions to conserve, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems, thus enhancing their ability to reduce or remove carbon emissions. And that means that we're talking about a very wide range of activities here, ranging from limiting deforestation or conversion of grasslands and shrublands, afforestation and reforestation, restoration, conservation of other types of important systems like peatlands, mangroves, seagrass beds, and marsh, and even improving forest and agricultural management, already modified, heavily modified systems, but improving them to sequester more carbon and generate other benefits. And these other benefits are really important. The real key thing about nature-based solutions is that they don't just sequester carbon or prevent release of carbon, but they also provide a whole range of other benefits, which we call co-benefits, meaning there's carbon sequestration, and these are the other additional benefits. And they are all these things that we value and love or think are important, such as cleaner air and water, flood and erosion control, increased biodiversity, and ability to actually adapt or recover from climate change and other impacts. But what we really know nature-based solutions, or why they've really become a global phenomenon, has to do with their relationship to carbon markets. And so I think it's important to talk a little bit about this because this has really been the area that we associate nature-based solutions with. So now in our carbon markets today, there's two types. There is the trade and regulatory compliance credits, which are carbon allowances. These are things that you have to do because you have to conform to regulations. And then there's the voluntary carbon offset credits, where basically you emit some carbon, but instead of reducing or mitigating your carbon, you actually go and purchase offsets of carbon elsewhere to offset your emissions. This is a voluntary carbon market, and this is the one where nature-based solutions has been having a great role. So now keep in mind, on the one hand, nature-based solutions provide a whole range of activities we can lump under nature-based solutions. Also, they generate all these different co-benefits, important ecosystem services, and other things. We're including, restoration as well as protecting existing and all that stuff. And in the process, they remove carbon emissions, and that's all the carbon markets care about, is their ability to store carbon. And today, just over a third of voluntary credits issued are for nature-based solutions. And at their peak in 2021, about $1.3 billion in nature-based credits were transacted. And that in value terms, was 2/3 of the entire value of the voluntary credits at that time. And what caused nature-based solutions to come onto our policy map was because this came out of nowhere. From 2010 to 2021, you just had this huge surge in issuing of credits for nature-based solutions. And then we started to get, and this is, again, demand from the voluntary credit, mainly from the private sector, to offset their carbon emissions. And that, pardon for the pun, but it fueled expectations about where this market was going. Some statements that are coming out at this time, including this article in Nature, predicted that, nature-based solutions, they kept growing. At the rate that they were going from this period, we could see about, 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year from now until 2050. And that is more than the total emissions produced by the global transport sector. So that was the prediction. Well, that's not what exactly happened. What has happened is that growth from 2010 to 2021, after 2021, it started to go down. And I'll show you some numbers in a minute. And the main reason, and many of you here probably have been following this, has been the concerns about how do we verify these things. We've been issuing all these credits at a great pace. Are they verifiable? And are they overvalued? How do they compare to credits from things that are not nature-based solutions? And that leads to the two things that interested Joe and me, is like, well, if we want to understand this phenomenon, what went wrong and why this is so difficult to do, we need to think about how we evaluate nature-based solutions projects. And also, there's these three things that seem to be very important to what's happened to the market, which is additionality, leakage, and permanence, which is a particular challenge for nature-based solutions. Anyway, I'll get to those things, but first I want to just show you the trends I just mentioned so you can see it. So you can see the huge rise that happened between 2010 and 2021 when it was at peak. The blue line is the amount of credits issued. The orange line is how many were retired, where people actually cashed them in, if you like, use them to retire or to offset their credits. So you can issue credits in the market, but somebody has to come along. Sophos has to say, I've got this big fossil fuel power station, and I need to offset some of my credits. So I will purchase some of the credits, then I'll actually retire them, use them to offset my credits. That's it. The credit is then taken off the market, and that is credited towards his emissions, offsets his emissions officially. So there was a surge, as I said, and then after 2021, so this graph here, this is pretty up to date. This is the data from April of this year. Now, obviously, the 2025 data, it's a little misleading because it's only the first 4 months. Okay, but up to 2024, you can see that the issues keep falling. The retirements have been kind of steady. So it's really issuing new credits that have fallen. And the retirements are carrying on. So what we suspect is going on is that nature-based solution credits that have already been issued are being retired at their normal pace every year, or at least normal pace since 2021. So we're taking them out of the market, but new issuings has definitely gone down. So we're back to levels that are, just before, in terms of issuers, back to levels just before around the pandemic period. But still, even though this drop has occurred, nature-based solution credits account for a large share of this market, the voluntary credit market. It's about 37% of all credits issued and about 37% of all retired credits. Okay, Now, another interesting thing is that we get a heck of a lot of publicity and media attention to certain types of nature-based solution projects, but often those projects aren't really the big ones, what I mean, they don't account for a lot of credit. So for example, there's a lot of attention often paid in the media and in discussions about blue carbon that's coming from wetlands and from coastal regions, marshland, seabeds. But actually, wetlands count very little for the NBS issues. The vast majority of NBS issued credits are coming from avoided deforestation, followed by avoided conversion of land. And afforestation, reforestation, which also gets a lot of attention, paying people to build trees. Yes, it may impact parts of the world importantly, but in terms of total credits issued, it's about 15%. But 75%, 3/4, are from basically avoiding bad things to land conversion, avoiding land conversion to stop releases of carbon. Okay, and most of that's for avoided deforestation, as I said. Okay, so when we started investigating how projects, NBS projects are evaluated on the ground, how do we go about deciding whether this project is worth the cost and benefits, given that it's going to get probably, in most cases, the studies we looked at end up get some of its returns from the carbon market. And one of the biggest problems that the literature tells us when we reviewed all the literature, and we went back to before nature-based solution days to studies of REDD and payment for ecosystem services for avoided deforestation and so forth. And all of them said the same thing, is that the current methods of establishing baselines is just not very good. It's rather ad hoc. They're rather unreliable. Now, a baseline is important, particularly when you're talking about avoided deforestation or avoided conversion, because you need to measure it against something, right? You need to know what you're doing in terms of stopping or avoiding deforestation conversion compared to what would have happened without it, your project. And there's been a lot of problems. There's been poor modeling and data. There's been uncertainty over comparisons between where the project is and the other area, which is used as the baseline or the control. And there's an appropriate location choice. An area would have been that should have been a baseline actually suddenly disappears, or it turns out not to be comparable at all. There's also been a major problem at the other end, which is baseline gaming to offset credits, to increase the number of offset credits. So if I say, oh yeah, this area would have been completely deforested if I hadn't done my project, and it turns out that may not have been the case, then I may use my false information in order to get more credits than I should get for what I'm doing. So that's baseline gaming. So you can, if you manipulate the baseline, you can therefore justify selling more credits or issuing more credits and selling them in the market. And of course, how this is done in how it's verified and monitored is, of course, an issue. The other thing that matters and is very important is, how do you measure the carbon benefit? So remember, for carbon markets, which are where a lot of nature-based solutions get their money, not all of them, but many of them do, carbon benefits are important to value. And the main way in which this is done is by evaluators using some measure of the social cost of carbon, which is essentially an estimate of, if we release carbon, a ton of carbon today, what would be the flow of damages from now into the future, discounted back to the present value. And that would give you the value of saving that ton of carbon And therefore, you can say, okay, I should get a credit if I'm saving that ton of carbon based on avoiding the social cost of carbon. Well, the problem is there is absolutely no agreement across the world, much less within countries and regions, of what the social cost of carbon should be, or how it should vary for, let's say, a different type of activity under nature-based solutions, such as reforestation, as opposed to for marshland or so forth. Now, some people say a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, doesn't matter what generates it, but it does matter in terms of how you view things like that go into the cost of it, which is where the damages might be, and also what the discount rate you use to bring it back to the present. And there's all sorts of rules and thumbs you can use, and people have different countries have different methods of doing it. Now, that could all be standardized. It's not a big problem, but what most evaluations do is they just take what they think is the right number, or they just go with what their national government is currently using, whether it's a good number or not, or an accurate number, or the right one that's being used right now. Often what happens is they'll measure the social cost of carbon, leaves out a lot of damages that we have difficulty measuring. So many economists today believe it's a gross underestimate of the damages. The other problem is damages are occurring much more sooner than we thought. So more damages are occurring today as opposed into the future. So again, it should be higher. So there's a huge, every few years, there's a reevaluation of what the social cost of carbon should be. And I don't blame people and project evaluators for having difficulty trying to sort through this literature. It's not easy. But there's another issue which is going to come back again, which is the issue of the risk of these types of carbon mitigation solutions. Now, keep in mind, these are nature-based solutions. They're not technological solutions or just removing a source of fossil fuel. So it depends on nature. And we all know that nature is a little bit finicky. It's not very predictable. Particularly if you're trying to restore something, there's a lot of failure of story. Also, one of the risks to nature-based solutions is the fact that we could lose them because someone could come along in 10, 15, 20 years and buy up the land, convert it. And this is a problem, is that how long do we really know the carbon storage will take place? Because how long will either that ecosystem that we restore survive, it may fail in restoration, and how long can we keep protecting it indefinitely, or at least long enough to justify the cost? So there's all sorts of things that have to go into thinking about these things. Andrew Balmford and colleagues and Ben Groom and Francis Veneman have written some really interesting articles about how to do this, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, that's just on the carbon side. But keep in mind, one of the things why everyone is excited about nature-based solutions is because it yields all these other benefits that are really important. And these benefits are important, but few of them are marketed. There's not even a voluntary market for these things, these ecosystem services. They require explicit economic valuation. So things like in wetlands, on coastal areas, what's the value of a wetland in terms of protecting against coastal storms? What's the value of the coastal wetland in terms of supporting offshore fisheries? These are important values of the system. One of the reasons why we want to invest in them and keep them is to not just to sequester carbon, but to deliver these other benefits, which are also more local. Also, what we're finding, so we have to go out and explicitly value these different things. In many forested areas, an important value is watershed protection. So again, how do we value that? There are no markets for that. So we have to go and value that and include those values in our evaluation of the nature-based solutions projects. The other thing that's very interesting is that I've been talking about all the things bad that can happen to nature, like from conversion and deforestation. But sometimes when people do invest in nature-based solutions, one of the surprising things they find when they start conserving and restoring natural systems is that there's important spillover benefits to neighboring systems. So if you protect enough, if anybody's worked in forest areas, you'll know this, is that if there's a protected area and you protect it, it can spill over into areas that are neighboring areas that are privately owned. And although the project may focus on protecting or restoring or rehabilitating, degraded areas in publicly owned land or land that's owned by some people, others may benefit from the spillover effects. Ecosystem services don't stay in one place. They go throughout the natural landscape. And so where the project is and where the project receives the money may not be, or where the benefits we think are going to the project may be shared with other surrounding areas. And others may be better. How do we capture that? How do we include that? We should include that, should think about that in our evaluation of the project. Otherwise, we may undervalue it. Probably the biggest controversy that's happening now in some regions is trade-offs between these benefits. So one of the assumptions, and this started with REDD+, is the idea of, yeah, we're going to have carbon benefits and we'll also get biodiversity benefits and we'll get other ecosystem service benefits. But in actual fact, there's some trade-offs here. And this particularly happens, in my experience, with afforestation and reforestation, is that if you're going to do an afforestation, reforestation project, and you're doing it because you think the main source of funding will come from carbon credits or some other carbon benefit that gets funded, you may change how you do, what species you select. You might go fast-growing species that can restore a lot of carbon in a very quick period of time and stuff, but that may not be so good for biodiversity. And it may not be very good if you end up with a restored system that has species in it that are very different from what was there before. The classic example I've come across that is in the mangroves, where mangroves have been converted in many parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, for shrimp farms and for other agricultural activities, and of course now for urban. Many Asian countries have realized that they're a natural barrier against storms and other coastal hazards like flooding. So they want to restore more mangroves. And they also want to qualify for blue carbon credits to help pay for the restoration. Well, the problem is the shrimp farms have either already destroyed the land and it's really unsuitable to regrow the mangroves there, or you've got palm trees, even palm growing because of palm oil right in the coastlines, or it's been converted to some other activity, maybe more urban area, more villages, more habitation. And basically you can't grow the mangroves where they were. So what do? They replant the mangroves on what used to be unvegetated tidal flats because it's cheaper rather than paying people to convert back to mangroves or to actually try and restore mangroves on degraded pond lands, which are very polluted. And you can reach your target much quickly. And you can say, voila, we planted all these trees, mango trees, a single species of mangrove. It's growing rapidly. That's going to generate the carbon credits. Anyway, so those are sort of things that happen. Now, that's on the benefit side. There's also these unique cost considerations you must have with nature-based solution projects. One of the things that's very surprising when you go through project evaluation is the opportunity cost of land is not often taken into account. So why is that important? Well, supposing you're avoiding deforestation with your project. If you did avoid deforestation, that land that you're going to hold as forest now in your nature-based solution project would have been converted to agriculture. Now, some of that conversion is not bad, but some of it's pretty productive. It's just not, it's going to change. It's going to deforest, and you end up, and you want to invest in the nature-based solution, but there's still the fact that the land would have been in agricultural production if you allowed the deforestation to take place. That's an opportunity cost of your doing the nature-based solution, by holding it as forest. That's important. Land is not cheap, and land is valuable for other uses than just nature-based solutions. You have to include the opportunity costs of other activities that would have been used instead of holding it forever or for a long time as a nature-based solution project. And that's just standard for any type of land use change, is that you're converting one type of land to another, so you have to take into account the alternative costs that would have happened with the other use. And it works both ways. If you were looking at agriculture as a way of, as a means of using forest land, you should take into account the opportunity cost of the land that is deforested as well. But the point is that often with nature-based solutions, we don't consider the opportunity cost of land. We treat it as if, okay, it was natural area or it's about to be deforested, it's natural area, it has no opportunity cost. The land is there, and it's therefore gives it zero. The other problem is monitoring, reporting, and verification. To keep track of all these things, you obviously need to have keep track of what's going on with the changes in nature, the changes in the ecosystem. You need to report anything that's it may be illegal going on or not up to standards for what's needed for carbon markets or even generating other benefits. And you need to verify any credits that you are trying to issue and sell. Those are additional costs that you wouldn't have if you just had a straightforward conservation project. But if you had a conservation project that you want to sell credits, you need to do all these things. And it needs to be done in a way that is transparent and it's verifiable and it's verified by a third party, by reasonable. And then, of course, there's the distributional impacts. Many parts of the world, particularly, let's say in Africa, land tenure is not secure. Customary land tenure is not the same, it is everywhere, and it's not the same as private land ownership. Yet, this matters a lot if you have a nature-based solution. Who owns the land? Is it the village with customary land, or is it some speculator coming in and saying, okay, if I set up nature-based solution project here, and take this land, which has just customary value, if I establish property rights over it, I can start holding on to it for carbon credits and so forth. And then there's other distributional impacts, which is the poorer you are, the less likely you're going to own land, and therefore the less likely you're going to be able to participate in a nature-based solution with your land. Your land holding might be too small, or you don't have any land at all, or it's not the right type of land, it's just enough for your family to feed on. So you really have no land asset that would qualify. You'd have to collaborate across a village and across maybe multiple villages to have enough land collectively to participate, and that may not be happening. So it's not surprising that in many places, unless it's carefully monitored, regulated, and so forth, many of those participating nature-based solutions are either public entities, large private entities, or large landowners, but not always. But it does matter. Okay, I've mentioned these three things, and I want to go through them rather quickly. Additionally, leakage and permanence. So additionality is related to the whole baseline problem I mentioned before, is that you got to compare what your project's doing compared to some baseline. If you're saying my project is going to conserve or avoid deforestation, and that's going to be saving X amount of carbon, I have to prove that against the baseline. In economics, over the years, there's been development of really good techniques to do this kind of thing on a large scale, which is impact valuation methods. And unfortunately, and these have been used, but unfortunately, they're not used well enough or often enough or in enough places to do this. And that's what we really need to start thinking about, is how do we use what we've learned from impact valuation estimates of looking at areas where deforestation is not controlled compared to areas where deforestation is controlled, to basically work out first the right baseline, and also working out what's the gain in terms of land use cover and conservation, and what's therefore the gain in credits, which is the additionality. A big issue in tropical countries in particular, but everywhere, is the problem of leakage. That one of the issues is that if we do nature-based solutions in one region or one location, the activities that would have deforested or converted the land there will shift somewhere else. So it's like a reverse offset, right? In a sense, sure, in this area, you were able to establish a nature-based solution project and bring in carbon credits, but all the pressure, land use pressure in that area shifted somewhere else, maybe even nearby, and deforestation has actually continued on. So you're supposed to be an offset to someone else's emissions. You've actually caused more deforestation and emissions as well. And one of the big issues, and one of the big problems here is that the backdrop to all this is we don't have sufficient policies to control deforestation and land use changes in many parts of the world. The policies just aren't there to prevent this type of leakage to happen. And on top of that, large-scale leakage undermines baselines and buffer pools of carbon credits. So the way the markets work is that small projects don't often generate enough credits on their own in order to offset credits. But so you need a portfolio of nature-based solution projects, all generating credits, to then go and sell in the market. Well, if you have a portfolio, then you have a portfolio of projects that are really doing quite a lot, to avoid deforestation or land use change in a particular part. And the problem is you might have leakage somewhere else. So what some people have done, some regions have done, California did this, is they created a buffer pool for the leakage. So they said, okay, here's the nature-based solutions that the carbon forestry offsets were doing. It's caused more development over here. So we're going to have another pool over here to offset the leakage problem, or to ensure that that covers the leakage problem. Sounds right. Sounds good, right? Except the problem is that what they found in California is that the areas that they used as their buffer happen to be the areas that burned down in wildfires pretty quickly due to climate change. And that also meant that the buffer stock, which was their baseline, was also out the window. So suddenly they lost their baseline for other things. So this is not just a developing country problem. This is a problem that's everywhere. It's particularly when we want large-scale results and large-scale contributions to markets. The last thing is permanence, and this is a big deal. I kind of made a big deal about the social cost of carbon, but permanence is even more important because, again, nature is risky, and also stopping the rate of change of land use is hard to do over a long period of time. So what's happened is we often don't know that if we invest in a nature-based solution to avoid deforestation or to conserve a natural area, we don't know how long it's going to last. Similarly, if we invest in an area to restore or rehabilitate degraded ecosystems, how long will it take, and what's the rate of failure of this restoration effort, which can be high in nature? And the result is there's a huge amount of risk involved with nature-based solutions. And we do a very poor job of adjusting the value of nature-based credits for this. So what the market does is they just give them a lower price in general. That's why nature-based credit values are often very low, is because it's assuming that you have all this risk built in. Now, that may be an ad hoc way, and it may sort of work, but there's another problem here, is that the market right now allows a nature-based credit to last for 20, 30 years, assuming that the system will be protected for 20, 30 years, but not beyond. Yet most other credits assume that whatever's the credit, like removing carbon emissions from a fossil fuel plant, that will last from 30 to 100 years. So we're not comparing like with like here. And that makes a real problem. Okay, now that gets me to the long run mitigation potential. Now, this may sound like I'm very negative about nature-based solutions, but I'm actually hoping that we recognize that nature's ability to sequester carbon is incredibly important. In particular, nature-based solutions are the only way in which we're going to, or some kind of conservation of nature is the only way we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors. But it's not going to solve all of our greenhouse gas problem. At most, the NBS potential, even under really optimistic scenarios, is 10 to 20 billion tons of carbon equivalents. And the total greenhouse gas emissions was more like 53.8 billion. So only a fraction of NBS, of global emissions could be offset or mitigated by NBS, even if it's successful and even if it's optimistic projections. The other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, the long-run mitigation of nature-based solutions depends an awful lot on its economic feasibility versus another way of mitigating emissions, which is conventional energy technology-based solutions. Solar panels, energy efficiency, investing in other renewables, reducing emissions through abatement and pollution, and so forth. And what is, looking at the evidence we had, what we found is that there's good reasons to believe that over time, nature-based solutions may be less cost-effective relative to these other solutions, which may be surprising to some of you, because the whole reason why nature-based solutions were promoted in the first place was they were said, well, they're one of the least cost ways of mitigating carbon. It's cheap to do it compared to more expensive energy-based solutions. Well, that's going to change. And it's changing because the same reason why we're seeing more renewable energy and more clean energy, more reductions of emissions through abatement, is that many of the energy and technology-based solutions, their costs are likely to fall because they are very susceptible to economies of scale, research and development, and technological improvements. The more you scale up these energy and technology-based solutions like clean energy and so forth, the more their costs are going to fall per unit. On the other hand, nature-based solution costs may be low today, but they're not going to fall that much more. So the costs of energy-based solutions are falling, and the costs of nature-based solutions are pretty constant, may even increase if we solve some of these challenges, because it's going to require more analysis, and particularly the verification, monitoring, evaluation. And if we do evaluate projects properly, include opportunity costs of land, that may also matter. And already one study that we looked at predicted this, is that over the next 30 years, the expectation is that the per unit energy and technology-based solution costs fall by about $19 to $50 per ton of carbon mitigated, whereas at most there's a slight rise in the costs of nature-based solutions, and it may even be a higher rise, up to $68. So costs falling for alternatives to nature-based solutions, costs to nature-based solutions staying, if we're lucky, more or less the same, and so forth. And you can see that very simply in a graph, is that on the horizontal axis, we have quantity of carbon sequestered, and we have two options. We have energy-based and technology-based solutions, nature-based solutions. Now, in today's market, that first supply curve that is rather steep is the supply of nature-based solutions, which is relatively cost-effective today. And then the other curve, the other one, is the supply of energy and technology-based solutions. So what you see in this, I don't think that was the laser, but never mind. What you see here is that nature-based solutions account for about up to Q0 amount of carbon mitigation. And then the remainder is by energy technology-based solutions, where it's more cost-effective to switch to those. But what will happen is, remember, the costs of nature-based solutions aren't going to change. So that first supply curve stays where it is. Demand for more mitigation rises, so the demand curve shifts out, but the costs of energy technology-based solutions fall. So what happens is nature-based solutions get crowded out. A much smaller amount of mitigation comes from them, not a bigger, but a smaller amount. And you end up, most of the mitigation comes from energy technology-based solutions. So this is something to keep our eye on. We have to watch this. So what we need to think about is investing in nature in general. And in particular, we do want to have some role for nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. They still matter because they reduce greenhouse gas emissions from a sector that's really important. The only sector they can do this in, or they're the only option for the forest loss, agriculture, the land use change sector. They also are important for particular types of ecosystems, like terrestrial and marine sinks of tropical countries, forests, peatlands, mangroves, seagrass beds, and marsh. And really importantly, they generate valuable co-benefits. But that means we should move away from thinking just that them as a source of carbon credits and for the voluntary markets. We're overly reliant on the voluntary carbon market. And as I just showed, the potential for them to outpace or outcompete other types of solutions is not looking good. So we need to think about additional financing for investing in nature, for generating all their benefits, not just carbon. And there are methods of doing this. Colombia and Costa Rica in 1997 and Colombia more recently in 2016 set up schemes where they used a small carbon tax on imported fossil fuels and basically used some of the proceeds to invest in nature conservation, including payment for ecosystem services. And in the Costa Rica case, they deliberately targeted communities where people were poor and where it wasn't dominated by large landowners. Probably a better way of financing, or another way of financing, not a better, but an alternative way of financing, is to remove environmentally harmful agriculture and forestry subsidies. This is something that the World Bank has been talking about for a while, how important this is, particularly for developing countries. But more importantly, we need to broaden the scope of additional financing for the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions. We need to stop thinking about them as just a source of carbon offsets. We need to think about them as generating a range of carbon and other benefits and fund the ecosystem, the asset that's generating these services, fund and protect them. It's still an issue. And there are many examples that we cite that could do this. So that gets to my big question. Why do we need more investment in nature? Why don't we just let it all disappear? Well, we all know the answer to that. First of all, it is disappearing. It's disappearing fast. And unless we invest in it, it's going to disappear even at a quicker rate. And as I mentioned at the introduction, this is a problem of rising what we call relative ecological scarcity. That we're producing all these marketed goods and services. They're all measured by GDP, and our GDP is going up, and it's increasing at around 2% per year. But meanwhile, ecosystems and habitats are disappearing, the services are disappearing, they're becoming more scarce, but their values are not appearing in our markets. In fact, as I just mentioned, we're subsidizing activities to destroy them. So on the one hand, ecosystems are disappearing and their services disappearing and species are disappearing, so they should be getting more valuable. That's what economics tells you. Their services are valuable. They're becoming more scarce. They should rise in price. So the benefits of ecosystems are more valuable and increasingly so. This is not something that is new. This is something that many of us have been talking about for a long time. Just over 30 years ago, Joe, myself, and Carl Folke summarized the workings of a group of economists and ecologists on the economics of biodiversity, the ecological economics, the ecology and economics of biodiversity. And we started off by saying, this is a major problem. The increasing relative scarcity of goods and services from the environment that have no value in our system. And it's magnifying. And of course, everything's in this paragraph, including the idea that it can become a global problem one day. So my last book that I wrote, Economics for a Fragile Planet, was really about this. Like, what's going on? Why are we nuts or something? Why are we doing this? Why are economies continuing to ignore the rising environmental economic costs of relative ecological scarcity? We've known about this for 30 some years. We've been arguing this for a while. And that gets back to the underpricing and undervaluing, and therefore underinvesting in nature. And of course, so those of you who are familiar with Partha Dasgupta's review, he says the same thing, is that our whole structure of market prices in our economy basically work against nature because we give it either a zero price or we effectively give it a negative price by paying a lot of activities to destroy it. And the zero price of nature is pretty straightforward. Our ecosystems are valuable assets, and they generate ecosystem services that benefit us now and into the future. But in the parlance of economics, they generally are goods and services that are non-rival, non-exclusive. They're public goods. They're available to everybody, but nobody has exclusive rights to them. But that also means nobody has an incentive on their own to protect and to maintain them. And then the assets themselves, once they disappear, once we convert, as I described with the mangroves, they don't come back. They're unreproducible in many cases. And of course, that's what's happening. The statistics we see all the time is about the reversible ecosystem loss and indeed risk of collapse that comes from it. Everything's getting increasingly scarce, but that scarcity is not in our marketplace. We hide our economy from it. And the only way to reveal all of this going on is to value and price ecosystem services and put it into public policy. But we're shying away from that as well. And in fact, we're going in the other direction, which is to say, okay, what are our main economic activities that we care about? We're giving them subsidies to actually harm the environment. So here are five of the most important ones: fossil fuels, water supply and sanitation, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. Per year, we spend just under $2 trillion on subsidizing these activities, which is about the GDP of Brazil. And just take agriculture, which is, again, one of the main things that is leading to the loss of nature in parts of the world, particularly tropical parts of the world. Agriculture, the subsidies could be as high as 1 trillion, as more. Not all of those are harmful, environmentally harmful subsidies, but the number in my table of around 200 billion per year could be a gross underestimate. But the World Bank, again, these are two World Bank studies. The World Bank, again, has shown that at least in agriculture in developing countries, agricultural subsidies alone are responsible for the loss of 2.2 million hectares of forest per year. So we're using subsidies to destroy our forests. There goes our baselines. There goes our need to try and protect forests, but then that means that the activities that would be in that area of the forest will go somewhere else. There's the leakage problem. And then there's always this threat hanging over what we do conserve. There's the permanence problem when we do try and issue credits or invest. And of course, all this means is that we're essentially underpricing means that we don't value the asset that's very important here, which is nature. If you don't treat something as a valuable asset, you're not going to maintain and enhance it. Now, when I was a student in Britain many years ago, when I was here doing a master's and PhD, this was a period of time when there was lots of squatting going on in cities, particularly in London. Now, if anybody's either been a squatter or know squatters or anything, you know that you take over a house that's empty and unoccupied, the last thing you're going to do is invest money in enhancing it. Essentially, our attitude to nature and our economy is to treat it as if we are a bunch of squatters. But we're not. We're here forever. And we treat nature as if it's worth zero value. It's an asset that has no value. And that's because we don't put a price on it when we do use it. So, not surprising, we underinvest in protection, restoration, and conservation. Not surprising that we have this weird way of saving nature right now, which is let's get voluntary carbon credits to fund nature-based solutions and solve nature that way. And of course, there's global financing gap all over the place. You know, we know how studies have shown how much we need to fund, and the gap is huge between what is actually being funded per year and what we're actually doing. It's also the same within industry. Kudos for Aoife, she was a big influence on this study report that looked at the 50% world of GDP is based on nature. And meanwhile, evidence shows that corporate sustainable supply chains really only spend a fraction on sustainability. And so what I'm trying to say is this is the number one problem. If you want to understand what's going on with why we're having a hard time dealing with nature and global environmental risks in general, is because we're squandering valuable natural and ecological capital. We therefore don't act on environmental risks. We just assume they're going to be something that's going to be dealt with later on because we don't want to have to deal with them now and face the costs. And that means that we're seeing increasingly environmental risks becoming greater economic and business risks. And we end up with this vicious cycle where we lose ecosystems and biodiversities, and human impacts on the environment therefore increase because we're giving the remaining assets so little value, even though they're disappearing. And that leads to excessive environmental degradation and ecological damage. And we repeat the whole process over and over again. And that leads to this rising ecological scarcity and at the same time, underinvestment in nature and so forth. And so we need to reverse this cycle. It's not easy, but this is something that we need to think about. So I've taken a long time. Do you want me to do the Peatlands stuff or should I just leave it? You want to hear this? It won't take too long. A few minutes, or am I run out of time? Okay, keep going. Okay, so all this sounds really depressing, and you know, I didn't mean it to ruin your weekend, but there are, however, ways in which we can start overcoming this. And that gets back to what I was saying about not thinking about nature-based solutions or nature as being a source of one service that we think is important, which is carbon sequestration. And it is important, but not just saying nature, that's the only thing that should matter to us, but thinking about nature as ecosystems, as assets, and whole landscapes and habitats like peatlands as being something that's very valuable that we need to think about how we conserve and restore. And it turns out peatlands actually sounds very depressing when you look at the range of peatlands loss, is that there's a study that was done that shows the projection. So the curve on the left is it shows you the rate of peatland loss projected, what it would mean in terms of releasing carbon emissions. But that's because peatlands basically store a lot of carbon. So that's a sign that the peatlands are disappearing quickly, which they are. And then in contrast, this is what would happen if we invested and restored in peatlands on the right, and we could actually bring down the rate of loss. And basically, if we carry on the way we're going, then converted tropical peatlands in particular could reach 300,000 square kilometers by 2050. And that's around 2 billion tons carbon dioxide annually. That's a lot. So it's a big deal. But I want to emphasize that peatlands aren't just about carbon. In fact, they generate a whole range of very diverse ecosystem services and really important ones. But almost all of these are non-marketed, meaning they don't appear market. They just benefit us either directly or indirectly. And you have to explicitly value them if you want to understand how valuable peatlands are. So we shouldn't think about peatlands just as carbon. We should think about generating a whole range of ecosystem services. So we're back to thinking about how do we restore and conserve a very valuable asset for us as humans. Now, there's actually some potential good news here. Is that when we actually looked at the numbers and the estimates, what is needed for peatland conservation and restoration is not as bad as we think. And there's also some other potential good news. So if we are able to invest in peatland conservation and restoration, either as nature-based solutions or just as, for conservation and restoration for all benefits, then we would actually save 800 million tons of carbon per year, which is basically Germany's annual emissions. So it's not insignificant. But most importantly, oops, I went the wrong way. There we go. The amount required globally isn't that much. It's about $28 billion for peatland conservation per year and about $12 billion for restoration. What's even more encouraging from an economic standpoint is that 8 countries are responsible for almost all of this. So if we could get 8 countries, these 8 tropical countries, on board with peatland conservation, then we've got a chance of saving lots of important tropical peatlands, which are going to be disappearing otherwise. Now, why do I say this is good news? Well, in economics, one of the problems we have discovered, and thanks to Scott Barrett in particular at Columbia, who's spent his life looking at this, is that it's really hard to get an international agreement or international collaboration when you have a large number of countries trying to cooperate. So generally, successful treaties or environmental agreements have been involved a small number of countries that are recipients and a small number of countries that or benefactors, if you like, or donors that want to help those countries. We did that with the Montreal Protocol for ozone depletion. Also, it helps if you can actually build in the financial and technical assistance can be part of the carrot that makes such a small agreement work. So when Joe and I were thinking about what we saw here with peatlands, we said that, well, the numbers aren't great. The numbers aren't bad in terms of, they're not great in terms of current losses and projected losses, but the possibility here is to have that type of agreement focused just on these 8 countries. So one of the global elements of the global strategy would be to come up with a coalition agreement, which would be a collaboration between a consortium of donors, including possibly some public-private partnerships, and the 8 major peatland developing countries I pointed to. And the donors would provide the carrot, which is the offer of financial technical support, conditional on verifiable policies and actions by recipient countries. What should those actions be? Well, they should be to monitor, verify, and protect and restore and change the underpricing of peatlands. A whole suite of policies could be on. Again, I'm not going to have time to go through all the detail, but one of the advantages of putting these policies in, such as what we saw in Costa Rica and Colombia, is that money can be generated. It could be spent on some of the benefits to local people as well as key investments. Also, this group, if it involved private-public partnerships, could move into some of these other areas of alternative financing. And eventually, if we get the 8 countries and the consortium of donors to work together and establish this, then we can extend it to other countries. So the global strategy, peatlands would have these 3 elements: adoption of policies conducive to peatland conservation and restoration, international assistance by the consortium, and then innovation of other financial mechanisms beyond just pure government aid. Eventually, it could be extended to other countries with peatlands and stakeholders, and the whole mission would be to end the undervaluing, underfunding of peatlands globally, and of course, in the process, global peatland restoration conservation, because we're treating them as valuable assets. What's going on today? Well, in actual fact, elements of this are starting to happen. There's an initiative in place that's sort of the successor to the Global Peatland Initiative called the Peatland Breakthrough Initiative, where already some donors, private and public stakeholders, are getting together with scientists and others, and including some of those recipient countries I mentioned, to actually talk about how we could do this type of strategy. Not quite the grand scheme that Joe and I came up with, but at least steps to start this process. And you can see from this list here, it's got a whole bunch of interesting combination of those in the donor group. And their first goal, I think, is a good one. It's like, what's our baseline? What are our targets and what's our baseline? What do we want to do here? And I think that's what they're doing right now, this summer, is to try and put together a working group to determine baselines and targets. I hope what they do, myself, is that they focus on the 8 countries and not try and do it globally for everybody. So that's important. Now, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. That's why. My bad. Okay, now, where does that leave nature-based solutions for peatlands? Well, they may vary from country to country. They may work in some, they may not. They should not all be about nature-based solutions. And one of the reasons why is that the 3 ecosystem services that are associated with peatlands aren't just carbon sequestration, although that's important, but also water and wildlife. And that means different things for different countries and different regions. In many developing countries as well, peatlands are an incredibly important source of harvested products locally. And in richer countries, you have a tendency towards recreation being an important benefit. So the suite of services are going to vary across country. So why have just one approach for all countries? It's got to be all about carbon sequestration and nature-based solutions. No. So in fact, in some parts and some regions, carbon sequestration may not be the most important benefit. And in fact, other environmental risks matter, including freshwater scarcity. And I'll leave you with a study that actually spent some time thinking about this role of peatlands, which is its potential peatlands stuff. And the study actually appeared in Nature Sustainability a few years ago, and it showed that, over 2,000 square kilometers of peatlands are incredibly important for the water supply of 71.4 million people. And in some countries, Ireland, and UK, peatlands are the source of almost all the drinking water. So why don't we see water companies and the government talking with peatlands and working out a strategy in UK and Ireland to try and deal with this? The problem is that this study went on to show that peatlands that are really important for water supply, just over a quarter, less than 30%, are actually protected, and that includes in this country and in Ireland. So there are ways in which we should be thinking about this a little differently. So for these peatland water supply hotspots, focusing on nature-based solutions, biodiversity offsets and stuff make a little sense. Instead, we could go back to what Costa Rica did when it pioneered payment for ecosystem services. The only service they were looking at was watershed protection. And they actually set up their whole method of payment ecosystem services, not for carbon payments, not for biodiversity, but in order to pay landowners in upper watersheds to conserve water, forests, and therefore water for downstream uses, such as drinking water, irrigation, and hydroelectricity. And it was quite successful. So let me just finish up. I've been hard on nature-based solutions, not because I don't think they're important. I do think they're important for net zero goals. As I said, they're really important for the land use sector in particular, but or the carbon emissions from the land use sector. But we need more assessment of the unique and multiple benefits that come out of these systems, not just focusing on whether we can generate credits for sold in voluntary markets. We also need to have reforms to the markets and also the way in which we evaluate the contribution of nature-based service credits to this market. And we particularly need more analysis of the policies to support nature-based solutions, particularly nature-based solutions where they are undermined by policies that cause excessive land use conversion and loss in countries. The future trade-off between nature-based solutions and energy and technological-based solutions is real, and we need to keep evaluating that because we want to make sure that we understand what's going on there. And we need to desperately broaden the sources of financing, particularly beyond just the carbon offset market and alternative forms of financing, particularly for other benefits. Again, like any other nature solution, we're really not going to address this problem adequately until we make more progress with the underpricing of nature problem. Carbon sequestration, at the end of the day, really is just only one benefit of important ecosystem assets. And the peatlands examples show that there are solutions that can be drawn up if we think a little bit more creatively and think of preserving whole landscapes, habitats, and less about focusing on one, even though it's an important benefit, which is carbon sequestration. So I'll leave you there. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. Really, really amazing talk. I've got 3 questions, but it's only fair to open up first. So are there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ed. Great, yeah, really, really interesting talk and really interesting. I know that your previous work was kind of a bit more on adaptation, economic valuation for adaptation, mangroves, et cetera. So it's interesting to see you kind of, yeah, the equivalent for on the mitigation side. I have a question about the definition that you're using for nature-based solutions in your talk and in your upcoming papers. So you're probably familiar with the UNEA, the UN Environmental Assembly definition of NBS, which has a kind of similar beginning of yours. So actions, to conserve, protect, et cetera, ecosystems that then address societal challenges. And then the second part of that definition is ensuring that these benefit human well-being and biodiversity. And so in that definition, it doesn't necessarily specifically refer to reducing and to removing emissions. So it doesn't necessarily refer to that mitigation piece. It could, it's multiple benefits for mitigation, adaptation, water, kind of all these different things. But the one that you're using kind of seems to be quite focused on the mitigation piece. And what we've seen is that kind of definitions that do focus on this mitigation piece. And this is, completely agreeing with your the points that you've been making in the second part of your talk, where we need to kind of look at the multiple benefits, the holistic suite of benefits beyond just kind of a narrow view of looking at carbon sequestration. But I would argue that using a kind of definition of NBS that includes that kind of focus on carbon sequestration in the definition is leading to this kind of narrow vision. So I'm just wondering how the definition that you're using kind of it's more about like framings and narratives that you're using aligns with the UNEA definition and kind of reflects the need to bring these multiple benefits and not just kind of thinking of carbon as the kind of primary benefit and the other ones as kind of co-benefits, but really how NBS can address kind of a multiple suite of benefits. Thanks.
Well, I'm delighted if we are moving in that direction. I mean, not too long ago, these were called natural climate solutions, and then we moved to nature-based solutions. But really, when you go talk to the carbon market people, they're basically still focusing on natural ways of sequestering carbon, and that's where a lot of credits are being generated. A lot of funding is, and a lot of projects. And also a lot of things that we've done for a long time: carbon forestry, carbon offsets that involve natural systems, RED programs, which says explicitly reducing emissions from deforestation, degradation. All these things, even payment for ecosystem services. When payment ecosystem services first came up, it wasn't for carbon mainly. It was for, as I said, for water, and then eventually biodiversity and other things, but water for a long time. But gradually carbon has become driving this area. And it'd be great if we go back to see its multiple benefits. And I hope that's the case. But I think only what we were trying to do here is say, what if we are focusing on nature-based solutions for climate mitigation, given the fact that so many $1 billion of carbon offsets go to nature-based solutions for this purpose? That's what we were trying to do. But I think that you can call them what you want, and you can do them. But if we don't address the underlying problem, which is the underpricing of nature in general and the undervaluing it, it's all we're talking about. The number of angels on a head of a pin here. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm getting too old for that.
I have the camera. Hi, Ed. Thanks for the great talk, and congratulations to you and Joe for the upcoming paper. I can't wait. Yeah, thanks also for the kudos. I feel like that was one of the most interesting policy interface experiences I ever had, certainly so early in my career. But yeah, I suppose following a little bit on from what Audrey said, just I also don't want to get into the pedantics of definitions, but I do think that sometimes discussing too much targets, we actually published a paper says having too many targets misses the mark. And then I also had a question about baselines. What do you do in the case? I got far too excited when you started talking about peatlands, so I'm going to not talk about peatlands too much now and talk about it over drinks. But what do you do in the case of a situation like peatlands, where actually we don't really know where they all are? So, you're talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Amazon basin, where we're still trying to find where they are, so we can actually say we have this much. A lot of those countries that you mentioned, they do have policies, but how can we actually derive any benefit from the policies if we don't know where they are? And and research and science is not getting the money to do it, or we're relying on remote sensing that has 28% accuracy on how big or how deep they actually are. And when you go there and you stick the stick in, and it's actually only, you know, a meter deep. And this isn't just anthropogenic change, this is also climate change. These are water place. So I mean, you have to think, is this even worth saving? Is it going to just dry up in, you know, 10 years anyway, which is what a lot of my ecologist friends say, which I don't like it when they do, you know. I'm like, no, let's push for the policy anyway and save the earth. So I was wondering, to link that in with what you were talking about with land value. I'm really interested in that because obviously with huge amount of urbanization, peri-urbanization of areas where these kinds of ecosystems are that are very interlinked, it's a huge issue would be things like draining rivers that are connected in, that isn't even part of they may not even see as part of the ecosystem, plus the value of the actual land, right? Communal, not communal, let's not even get into that. What about where it has no value for anyone? What about where there's no value? So like, say we take the reverse gaze. Red became red plus because all these problems came up, right? So payment for so you know, nature-based solutions, I see it the same. You know, it's you know, and I sat with Robin Shasden for like 5 days trying to write when is a forest, and we were like, oh, this is just, these are fads in a way, but let's like talk about what we can actually do in the ground. So what about the conflict-free areas like peatlands? Okay, so not necessarily just talking about wetlands here, because wetlands, you could have a highland wetland and put some sheep on it and then it's worth something. But there are areas, huge areas of peatlands that are not worth anything to local people, except for, yeah, some spiritual stuff, some hunting. They're not really worth anything to drain, they're too far away. You know, they don't really have any value. And how do you think we could connect that to direct payments, for example, to Indigenous communities for other things, so that the conservation of nature is kind of a byproduct? So, for example, direct payments to places where we know that there are peatlands that no one really cares about. It's not conflict. It's no conflict there like there is with, like, you know, cedar and, like, you know, big old growth forests. We don't have that conflict there. It's an amazing opportunity. You go there, the Indigenous people call it to me, oh, the black gold, because they are finding out that, you know, this stuff is worth something that they didn't even have a word for, really. So if we look at it like, you know, backwards, maybe like, what about like somewhere that has no value, giving it value, and not having these like things that we have in REDD+ and we have in nature-based solutions, where it's all kind of mitigating, as we said, or stopping or whatever. I think that's a huge part of the problem, is what we already have. How can we protect it, especially areas where we've identified no conflict, no value, somewhere easy to conserve by taking another route in? Sorry, it took so long to say that question.
No, that's right. I actually think an area that has no value yet for any kind of commercial economic activity, and we know it has a valuable ecosystem in it, and one that's disappearing around the world, which is peatlands, then we should really pay for it, and pay to have it protected, and pay local people. And there's several ways of doing it. The old way to do it, and how many protected areas were started, were because there were areas that nobody else wanted. They had no value. You know, they were too difficult to farm. They're too difficult to ranch. They were maybe not enough wild animals so Teddy Roosevelt could shoot them all. But we went and created protected areas and for these areas. And I'm glad we did, because it's been much harder to protect areas that are under threat. But someone has to pay for it, and there's two ways of doing it. One is the old way, which is to get somehow, if it's peatlands are valuable as a global asset, then we should figure out a way of ensuring that funds get there through the old donor system. The other way is ways in which some, believe it or not, some financiers people are trying to work out, which is how to do blockchain financing of natural assets, where you don't actually sell and buy the asset, but you sell and buy a digital token that's based on the asset, and then you trade, and the share of the assets go back to the local people. And that's being applied in different parts of the world right now. It's not something that's very big at the moment, but it has the potential. There's a couple of projects in very remote places where this is happening. And it's actually got a potential. I don't know how successful it will be, but that's a different way. We can figure out other ways of doing these things. But we need to be sensible about what's our priority, or is it to protect areas that aren't going to be developed anyway for a little while, or should we be protecting areas that are really under pressure right now that are also incredibly valuable, but just that they're also valuable for oil or conversion to oil palm or agricultural development or so forth. You know, that's a big issue. But we need to think less of it as we have to, first of all, I think, change our whole view of nature as something that isn't becoming increasingly scarce. And so something that may appear not to be valuable today could become valuable very soon, even if it right now, we're not quite sure what it's doing, where it is, and so forth. But there are whole regions. I mean, this is where maybe peatlands as carbon is important, because if those trends are correct and we're losing 300,000 square kilometers of peatlands in tropical areas, then we better pretty soon protect those areas that are not threatened as soon as possible. So yeah, there's a lot of ways of tackling that.
Okay, brilliant. We're drawing to a close. I'm going to ask one, and then there's time for one more after this. A quick one is economists get quite a bad rep for they often get implicitly associated with defending the interests of capital. And I think one of the key takeaways here is that, you know, actually loads of the stuff that we need to do is confront vested interests and power, right? So all of the discussion, for example, about taking on perverse subsidies is actually just, it's a political economy question about a government being able to take on a vested interest who has been the beneficiary of a past subsidy, basically. So what, in your view, is the role of economists, should the role of economists be in confronting power?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that nature is an asset. Once you do that, then you start thinking differently about what's our portfolio of assets, right? And then once you start doing that, then you start, as an economist, then you start to realize we're managing a series of assets in our to create what we consider prosperity, which is human capital, physical capital, and natural capital. Then we have to look at natural capital and say, okay, what appears in our market system and what doesn't? And unfortunately, much of the things from nature that we now realize is becoming increasingly scarce, and what is beneficial to us is disappearing. It doesn't appear in our markets. So once you start doing that, you can then say, well, what do we need to change? And I've been saying the same thing for 30, 40 years, you know, warning about the threat of, you know, growing relative ecological scarcity, that it's going to get worse, not better. So we keep ignoring it. It's like ignoring, you know, a chronic disease. And you got to just keep going and saying these things. And you got to keep telling people there's an alternative way of looking at the world. And it's to think about nature as one of our most important and quickly disappearing assets. And we're not replacing it with anything that can do nearly as valuable things that it can do. And that's a major problem. And you have to keep talking. I have to hope. So many of my colleagues who are in the same mindset as I am think that we'll never get the solution to this problem unless we have a major economic crisis, the existing system collapses. Well, we've had two crises that I'm aware of that have been pretty major, where we thought we would build back better. One was the Great Recession, and the other has been the pandemic. And each time there's enthusiasm about building back better and dealing with these subsidies, saying we can't afford it, and let's make our economies greener. And we're making progress in one area, which is in energy technology-based solutions, moving towards more clean energy. I think the clean energy transition is coming out. I've just written a comment in Nature that's just, it's online now and it's coming out. And my argument there, and in my lecture at the Oxford Martin School, my argument was the same, is that I see clean energy transition coming. It's not coming fast enough, but it is coming. But it's going to lead to better prosperity if certain world leaders don't keep screwing it up. But it's not going to be sustainable because we're still not treating nature like it's the valuable asset that we want. So unfortunately, you know, my whole career I've been arguing this, and I'm hoping that that you know, ecological economists like yourself and many others, and environmental economists and policy people and people from other fields, ecology, social sciences in general, re-emphasize this point, keep going until we get some movement, so people understand, because I don't know what else to do.
So last question.
So maybe just in response to that, I think what often moves financial markets is risk. So how you price in risk, and then the asset prices kind of settle around that. I'm interested to hear your reflection on, you know, the work that Nicola Range is doing, for example. The fact that I think they've calculated that loss of biodiversity is actually a bigger risk to the economy than carbon is, climate changes. But I was interested to hear what you think the role of carbon and nature markets are in, specifically in low income countries, where the opportunity costs are not just the opportunity cost of land use, but it's actually the opportunity cost associated with development. So many of them are commodity driven economies. And what that means is that you have to leave commodities in the ground. And, you know, coupled with that, there's the element of, you know, bringing funding in through the markets as opposed to bringing in reparative funding from historical emitters, which is the reason why these decisions need to be taken in the first place. And so I just wondered, what you thought about these markets in the countries, and what you think maybe bigger levers might be to drive policies, national policies that would support, you know, nature-based solutions.
Yeah, that's a lot there. Let me start with environmental risks and risks. I've been making the case, Joe and I have been making the case, and certainly in Economics for a Fragile Planet, I strongly argue the case that environmental risks are business risks, and increasingly coming that way. And we have the evidence to show that. And what's more important is in critically key industries and sectors are starting to see that, and particularly finance and insurance. And so I think that you know, to go back to Sophus, maybe that's the way to get to policymakers, is through these industries. I think some parts of the agriculture industry are also going to see that increasingly with supply chain risks, and so on. And then loss of things like pollination services. You know, in the United States, just before we left, there was a prediction that bee populations were going to fall by 25–30%. It just predicted for this year. Wild bee what's that going to do to pollination of agriculture? I don't know the answer to that. That's just one example. But all I'm saying is that there are all these risks that are coming. I wrote a whole book just about water because it's a fascinating subject, but also incredibly complex. But water risks are the story that aren't being told enough. And yet it intersects between biodiversity, nature, and climate. And we live in the Mountain West in the Western United States, which is very arid, semi-arid. It's a water scarce area. So that's a huge risk. And the businesses there are taking it seriously, are starting to, not all of them, but some of them. So there's all these things that are, I think, starting to become apparent, that are important. Now, back to developing countries, one of the things I'm not an advocate of is saying that that emerging market and developing countries should grow less and should develop less. But what I am an advocate of is that they could develop better, and they could develop better by doing less silly things with their money. One is the fastest growth of agricultural subsidies is actually occurring in emerging market and developing countries. And,
Because I know you said that.
it's about, I don't normally do it by income because I follow what the convention is. You could do it other ways if you wanted to, but let's just say I mean, there's three groups of countries. There's the relatively rich, advanced countries, which we can call high income if you want. Then there are certain countries that are very large, or fast developing and really becoming dominant market leaders in certain areas, and that's the emerging markets. Then there are developing countries that are not, they're smaller and they often are more dependent on their resource base and often for exports of some kind. And they vary in income from middle income all the way down to some of the poorest countries in the world. And those we can call generally developing countries. But they're heterogeneous groups in all of them. So it is a hard category. But the countries that depend on natural resources that are trying to deal with terrible poverty problems, increasing inequality, needs for infrastructure, more investment in human capital, more investment in physical infrastructure and stuff, they need to use their natural resources to do that. That's going to involve some degree of conversion or loss of the natural resources or use of them. And they need to use that money wisely. It doesn't make sense if they're exporting products and then spending a huge part of the government budget subsidizing agriculture, which is harming the environment, which then undermines the natural resource base of, let's say, fishing industries or forestry or poor people's livelihoods. It's counterproductive for alleviating poverty. So I think one needs to look very carefully at what's going on with policies within developing countries and point out where they could do things better in terms of managing the resources they have more efficiently and more sustainably, and to make sure that the proceeds lead to a more diversified and balanced economy, so they're not just dependent on natural resource exploitation forever, because that's what's happening in many cases. If you get too dependent on natural resource exploitation, you end up focusing on 2, 3, 4, 5 major commodity crops, and it's all about that, and it's all about exporting them. And you get into kind of a trap where you think that's what we have to do, is export these products to earn more money, and we're not reinvesting in human and physical capital, and we're not doing it efficient, managing those natural resource and the resource base of our economies in an efficient and sustainable way.
We're going to bring it to a close there. So please, would you join me in welcoming and in thanking Professor Edward Barbier.
If you're able to stay for drinks, it's just along in the atmosphere room, which is just down there to the left.